There are horrors we expect in true crime. Blood, bodies, madness. But every so often we stumble upon something so perverse, so grotesque it forces us to look away, then back again. Not because we're fascinated by death, but because of what comes after. What if the killer didn't just take a life, but took a bite? This is not metaphor. This is not exaggeration. This is the story of human beings, ordinary on the outside, monstrous within, who butchered their victims and served them like supper. Sometimes to strangers, sometimes to family, sometimes to themselves. Albert Fish, the grey man's recipe for horror. He was the kind of man you'd never remember. An elderly gentleman in a faded suit with tired eyes and a polite smile. Harmless, unassuming, forgettable. But behind that frail frame lived a demon, Albert Fish, born in 1870, a name that sends a cold ripple through true crime history, known as the Grey Man, the Brooklyn Vampire, the Boogeyman. But none of those nicknames truly captured what he was, because Fish didn't just kill children, he cooked them. It was 1928. 10-year-old Grace Budd went missing from her home in New York. A soft-spoken man had offered to take her to a birthday party. Her parents, poor and desperate, had trusted him. That was their last glimpse of Grace. What happened next remained a mystery for 6 agonizing years, until a letter arrived, yellowed, handwritten, sent to the Budd family. It was a confession. Fish described, without remorse, how he took Grace, strangled her, dismembered her, and slowly cooked her flesh in a stew. He wrote about her body the way a chef might describe lamb chops. "It took me 9 days to eat her entire body," he wrote. "She died a virgin." He mailed that sentence to her mother. This wasn't madness. This was method. Fish didn't kill for money or jealousy or revenge. He killed to satisfy an appetite. He was obsessed with religious punishment, pain and flesh. He inserted needles into his own pelvis for pleasure. He saw suffering as sacred. Eating human meat, that was salvation. His crimes weren't discovered through a trail of blood, but through a trail of letters. He wanted the families to know, to feel it, to relive it. And when he was finally arrested, he didn't beg for mercy. He welcomed death. "It will be the supreme thrill," he whispered. "The only one I haven't tried." Albert Fish wasn't just a killer. He was the man who made horror intimate. And if you think that's the darkest this story gets, just wait. Because the next man didn't just write about his crimes, he served them hot, fresh, and straight from a roadside grill. Joe Metheny, the cannibal with a grudge. Joe Metheny didn't wear a mask. He didn't hide in the shadows. He told the world exactly what he did, and smiled while doing it. Standing over 180 centimeters tall and weighing more than 200 kilograms, Metheny was a towering slab of fury. A former truck driver, a junkyard drifter, a man who lived in a dirty trailer beside a pallet company in Baltimore, and according to him, turned murder into a business. It started, he said, with heartbreak. His girlfriend left him, took their son, disappeared into the back streets of Baltimore. Metheny claimed he searched the drug dens and alleys not to bring her home, but to kill everyone who reminded him of her. Revenge wasn't enough. He needed control, he needed a ritual, so he began luring sex workers to his trailer, and once inside, they never left. He didn't just kill them, he dismembered them, stored their flesh, and turned it into meat. According to his own chilling confession, Metheny kept human remains in his freezer, mixed them with pork, grilled them over a flame, then served them on sandwiches from a small food stand he set up on weekends. He fed people, co-workers, strangers, customers who smiled, paid, and walked away, never realizing what they had just eaten. "They were very good," he said. "If you mix it with pork, nobody can tell the difference." He said it casually, like a joke, like a memory, like it meant nothing. But here's the thing. Joe Metheny wanted you to know. He claimed more murders than police could verify. He described crimes with unholy detail, and whether all of it was true or not, didn't matter, because it wasn't just about what he did. It was about what he wanted you to imagine. The next time you bite into something unfamiliar, would you taste the difference? And just when you think it couldn't get more twisted, we travel back to 1930s Italy, where a woman known as the soap maker of Correggio turned her victims into pastries and even soap, all for love. Leonardo Cianciulli, the soap maker of Correggio, Italy, 1939. The world teetered on the edge of war. But in the quiet town of Correggio, a very different kind of terror was brewing. Leonarda Cianciulli was a mother, a widow, a soap maker, and a serial killer. Her story begins with heartbreak, miscarriage after miscarriage. 17 pregnancies, only 4 of her children survived. She became obsessed with protecting them. Superstition consumed her, and when her eldest son enlisted in the Italian army, she believed only one thing could save him from death: human sacrifice. So Leonarda made a plan. She invited women into her home, women who trusted her, lonely, vulnerable women looking for advice or help. She drugged them, axed them to death, then boiled their corpses in a cauldron. The fat floated to the top. The bones dissolved. What remained, she turned into soap. Yes, soap. I made soap out of her, she later told police. The fat was creamy and white. I gave bars to neighbors and friends. The cakes turned out well too. I served them with tea. She wasn't joking. Leonarda baked the remains into sweet, nutty pastries, served them with smiles, and even wrote postcards on behalf of her victims, forging messages to loved ones so no one would suspect they'd vanished. She believed it was an act of love, a mother's sacrifice to protect her son from fate. But when she was caught, she showed no remorse. In prison, she became a model inmate, quiet, helpful, even proud. She died in an asylum in 1970, still convinced that her soap had saved her child's life. Leonarda Cianciulli didn't kill for pleasure. She didn't do it for hunger. She did it for devotion, which somehow makes it worse. Because when love turns to ritual, nothing is off limits. But if this woman hid horror in pastries and perfume, what happens when the victim volunteers to be eaten? Meet Armin Maiwes, the man who posted an online ad looking for someone willing to die for dinner. Armin Maiwes, the man who ate consent. This story doesn't begin in a basement or a dark alley. It starts online. In 2001, deep inside an internet forum devoted to cannibalism, a man named Armin Maiwes posted a simple ad looking for a well-built 18 to 30-year-old to be slaughtered and then consumed. Not a prank, not a metaphor. He meant every word, and then someone answered. Bernd Brandes, a 43-year-old engineer from Berlin, replied to the ad. He didn't just accept the offer, he insisted on it. In emails, Brandes described exactly how he wanted to die. Slowly, painfully, with full awareness. So Armin invited him over. The two men met in Maiwes' half-timbered home in Rothenburg, Germany. They had dinner, drank wine, watched a Star Trek movie. Then they walked upstairs. What happened next is almost beyond comprehension, but it was recorded, with a video camera. Because both men agreed, if this was going to happen, it would be documented. The acts that followed were not a sudden burst of violence. They were methodical, agreed upon, choreographed. Brandes was alive for hours, until he wasn't. And then, Maiwes ate him. Over the course of months, he stored the meat in his freezer, fried it with garlic, ate it with potatoes. He called it the best meat he'd ever tasted. He didn't kill again, not out of guilt, but because in his mind he had found the perfect partner, a man who wanted to be consumed, a volunteer. Maiwes was only caught when someone stumbled across his forum posts and alerted police. When they raided his house, they found the video, the freezer, and what remained of Bernd Brandes. Germany was horrified, but the courts were confused. Was this murder or assisted suicide? After a retrial, Armin Maiwes was sentenced to life in prison. To this day, he reads the Bible, claims he regrets what he did and warns others not to follow his path. But the question still lingers. If someone wants to be eaten, is it still a crime? From a consensual feast, we now turn to a man who claimed his actions were cultural, that he ate to honor beauty. That flesh was not food, but art. Meet Issei Sagawa, the man who killed and then became famous for it. Issei Sagawa, the celebrity cannibal. In 1981, a young Japanese student named Issei Sagawa walked into the Sorbonne in Paris with a secret obsession. He didn't want to hurt someone, he wanted to possess them, entirely. Sagawa was small, barely over 150 centimeters tall, with a frail frame and a nervous demeanor. But behind his timid smile hid a desire so dark, he later called it a lifelong dream. He became infatuated with a Dutch classmate, Renee Hartevelt. She was tall, confident, brilliant. Everything he believed he wasn't. He invited her to dinner. She agreed, trusting him as a quiet fellow student. What she didn't know was that he'd already bought the rifle. During that evening, as she read poetry aloud at his request, he shot her in the neck. She died instantly. But for Sagawa, that was only the beginning. He spent the next 2 days defiling her body, eating her flesh, photographing the process, not in frenzy but in ritual. In his mind, it wasn't murder, it was absorption. He believed consuming her would allow him to take her strength, her beauty, her essence. He was caught days later trying to dump the remains in a park. Now here's where the story turns surreal. Issei Sagawa was declared legally insane by the French courts and unfit to stand trial. He was deported to Japan, where he walked free. He became a minor celebrity, wrote books, gave interviews, even appeared in magazines and documentaries, smiling, candid, describing in detail how human flesh tastes. Like raw tuna, he claimed, or horse. He lived in the open, among a society that seemed both repulsed and fascinated. To some, he was a monster, to others a twisted curiosity. But one thing was undeniable: he turned murder into fame. Sagawa never killed again. He lived the rest of his life in the public eye, broke and ashamed, but never silenced. And in doing so, he revealed something chilling. The world doesn't just fear cannibals. Sometimes it gives them a microphone. But if Sagawa used infamy to stay alive, the next killer took a darker path. Because Nicolas Claude didn't just eat human flesh. He drank blood, worked in a morgue, and called himself a vampire. Nicolas Claude, the vampire of Paris. Paris, the city of light, of romance, of history. And in the 1990s, of one self-proclaimed vampire who fed on death like an addiction. Nicolas Claude wasn't hiding in the shadows. He dyed his hair crimson, wore black eyeliner, listened to death metal and devoured horror films. But none of it was just for show. Claude didn't just fantasize about blood. He drank it. He worked at a mortuary. By day he painted corpses, filed death certificates. But after hours, he opened the drawers, unzipped the bags, took souvenirs, organs, teeth, blood samples, and then he took it further. In 1994, Nicolas shot and killed a man in his apartment, not out of rage, not for money, but for the thrill, for the taste. He later confessed to consuming parts of the victim's body, and more disturbingly described it with the cold detachment of a chef. He kept body parts in jars, practiced rituals, watched slasher films while chewing human flesh. When police raided his apartment, they found evidence of his obsessions: satanic artwork, medical books, surgical tools, and bone fragments. His room was a shrine to death, but Claude didn't deny it. In fact, he embraced it. He told the court he was a vampire. That blood gave him strength, that the taste of human flesh wasn't horrifying, it was empowering. He spoke of necrophilia, cannibalism, and the ecstasy of violence as if he were describing a meal. And after serving over a decade behind bars, he was released. Yes, released. Today, Nicolas Claude is still alive, active, online. He sells artwork, gives interviews, shares memories of his crimes with eerie calm. He's not hiding in the dark anymore. He's embraced the spectacle. And as disturbing as his crimes were, it's the audience that's just as haunting. Because in an age of clicks and likes and morbid curiosity, even monsters can build a following. But if Claude was a vampire feeding on death, the next man didn't hide his madness in mysticism. He killed with a hammer, fried brains in butter, and told doctors he wanted to be a chef. Peter Bryan didn't just eat, he cooked. Peter Bryan, the chef of madness. London 2004, it started with a hammer blow. Peter Bryan was already known to the system, diagnosed with schizophrenia, institutionalized after murdering a young woman and setting her body on fire. He told doctors he heard voices, that he needed help, that he didn't want to kill again. They believed him, so they let him out. Not into full freedom yet. First, he was transferred to a less secure mental hospital. He charmed the staff, played the role, patient, cooperative, calm. And then he asked for a bit more independence, permission to go on walks, buy groceries, cook his own food. It seemed harmless. Until the day he knocked on his friend Brian Cherry's door. Within hours, Cherry was dead. But that wasn't the shocking part. When police arrived, they found Peter Bryan standing in the kitchen, calmly frying a pan of human brains in butter. Cherry's dismembered body lay nearby, seasoned, prepared. "I was just about to eat it," Bryan said without emotion. He told investigators it was something he'd always wanted to try: human flesh, especially the brain. "I thought it would be nice," he explained, "hot, with butter tasty. He was rearrested, reinstitutionalized, watched more closely, but not closely enough, because just 2 months later, inside Broadmoor Hospital, one of the UK's most secure psychiatric institutions, Peter Bryan struck again. He beat a fellow patient to death with a weightlifting bar. No cannibalism this time, but the pattern was clear. Peter Bryan wasn't driven by delusion. He was driven by curiosity, not rage, not desperation, just a cold desire to taste what should never be tasted. And what terrifies the most is how easily he hid it, from mental health professionals, from the courts, from those who believed he was healing. If Bryan was the polite killer with a skillet, the next man was the predator of the woods, a man who used the dark web to lure the vulnerable, who called himself a collector of meat. Meet Matej Kurko, the cannibal from Slovakia who offered his victims one thing, a peaceful death and a place on his plate. Matej Kurko, the dark web butcher, Slovakia, quiet, forested, peaceful. But in the heart of those woods, something unimaginable was happening. Matej Kurko was a tech-savvy family man. He worked in IT, lived in a quiet suburb, had a wife, kids, neighbors who described him as polite, maybe a bit cold, but never dangerous. But behind the screen, he was a predator. Kurko prowled cannibal fetish forums on the dark web, looking for one thing: volunteers, people who were suicidal, depressed, desperate. He offered them peace, a way out, a final wish fulfilled, death and consumption, and some of them said yes. He arranged meetings deep in the forest, promising them a painless death. Some never showed, but others did. And once they arrived, he kept his promise. Kind of. He killed quickly, dissected efficiently, stored the flesh in his refrigerator, and buried the bones in the hills. Like a hunter preserving game, he referred to the bodies as meat. His downfall came when he approached the wrong person, a Swiss man who contacted police instead. Authorities set up a sting, posed as a willing victim, arranged to meet Kurko in the woods. But Kurko sensed the trap. When officers moved in, he opened fire. A shootout followed. He was hit multiple times and died in the hospital days later. What they found afterward was chilling. 2 confirmed victims, body parts in coolers, thousands of messages discussing methods, rituals, seasoning. He had built a manual for death, step by step, cold, mechanical, and yet he believed it was mercy. Kurko didn't kill in rage. He believed he was helping people and collecting souvenirs. A man who cooked death like a programmer runs code. But while Kurko lured the willing, the next killer targeted the innocent. Because when Andrei Chikatilo stalked the Soviet countryside, no one was safe. Children, teenagers, women. His appetite was insatiable, and his weapon of choice? His teeth. Andrei Chikatilo, the butcher of Rostov. For over a decade, a phantom haunted the Soviet Union. He moved through train stations, bus stops, and lonely forest paths. He blended into the grey fabric of post-war Eastern Europe. Quiet, awkward, invisible. And yet he left a trail of horror unlike any the USSR had ever seen. Andrei Chikatilo, teacher, father, cannibal. Between 1978 and 1990, Chikatilo murdered at least 52 people, possibly more. His victims ranged from young girls to teenage boys to women. There was no single type, just opportunity. He lured them with kindness, promises of food, warmth, a place to stay. But once they were isolated, he changed. Chikatilo didn't just kill. He mutilated, bit, tore flesh from the bone, often while his victims were still alive. He stabbed them in frenzies, used his teeth like a predator, and in some cases, ate parts of their bodies on the spot. Why? Because Chikatilo was impotent. He couldn't find release through sex, but violence, pain, the sight of suffering, that he understood. He became addicted to the ritual, the build-up, the chase, the tearing. Soviet authorities were baffled. Serial killers weren't supposed to exist under communism. It was a Western sickness. For years, the police chased phantoms, arrested the wrong men, even executed one innocent man for Chikatilo's crimes. All the while, the real monster walked free, teaching, working, smiling in public, slaughtering in secret. His arrest in 1990 ended one of the most terrifying manhunts in modern history. During his trial, Chikatilo sat in a steel cage, snarling, rambling, grinning like a beast at feeding time. He was executed by a single gunshot to the head. But what still haunts the case isn't just the body count. It's how long it took, how often he was questioned and released, How close the system came, again and again, only to let the monster walk back into the dark. Chikatilo wasn't just a cannibal. He was a reminder that evil can wear a teacher's tie, sit next to you on the bus, offer you help, and then feed on your flesh. But if the butcher of Rostov was driven by impulse, the next man was driven by fantasy, because Ed Gein didn't kill for the thrill of blood. He killed to build a new skin. Ed Gein, the flesh collector. In the frozen stillness of the 1950s rural Wisconsin, there was one house locals avoided. It wasn't the peeling paint or the overgrown yard. It was something deeper, a smell, a silence, a feeling in your bones. The home of Ed Gein. By all appearances, he was a shy, reclusive man, lived alone, helped neighbors, ran errands in town, harmless, until police walked through his front door. What they found inside would rewrite the blueprint of American horror forever. A chair upholstered in human skin, bowls made from skulls, a belt crafted from nipples, a lampshade made from a face, and in the back shed, the mutilated, headless body of a missing woman, hung upside down like a deer. But here's the twist. Ed Gein wasn't primarily a killer. He was a grave robber. He dug up bodies, fresh ones, ripped from the earth, not for vengeance or pleasure, but to create. Because Gein had a dream, a twisted, obsessive vision. He wanted to become his mother, literally. He crafted suits of skin, breasts, genitals, masks, a full-bodied transformation stitched together from corpses. At night he wore them, danced in them, became someone else. When he did kill, it was rare but devastating. 2 confirmed victims, possibly more, and yet his legacy eclipsed his body count. Ed Gein inspired Norman Bates in Psycho, Leatherface in the Texas Chainsaw Massacre, Buffalo Bill in Silence of the Lambs. He became the American archetype of cannibalistic horror, but he never saw himself that way. In court, he appeared dazed, detached, childlike. He spoke softly, said he loved his mother, just wanted to feel close to her again. He spent the rest of his life in a mental institution, painting pictures and gardening, never tried to escape, never hurt anyone again. Because in his mind, he wasn't a monster, he was a son. But if Gein dismembered the dead, the next man dismembered the living, right out in the open. Because Durangel Vargas didn't hide in the shadows. He lived in a shack by the river and called himself a meat-eater. Durangel Vargas, the riverbank cannibal. In the city of San Cristobal, Venezuela, there was a man who lived under a bridge. He had no electricity, no running water, just a tin shack, some rusty pots and a few knives. His name was Durangel Vargas. Locals called him El Comediante, the people eater. For years, missing persons cases piled up in the area. Young men, vagabonds, workers, vanishing without a trace. Most were written off, victims of poverty, crime, the jungle. Until one day in 1999, when police followed a trail of bones and blood to Vargas's shack. Inside, they found horror. Human limbs stored in containers, organs wrapped in cloth, a spine dangling like cured meat. Pieces of at least 10 people, collected, prepared, arranged. Vargas didn't resist. He confessed immediately. "I make soup," he said, "with hearts, with livers, but no fat people. They're no good for eating." He smiled when he said it. Authorities were stunned, not just by the carnage, but by his demeanor. Vargas wasn't agitated. He wasn't insane in the typical sense. He was calm, proud, even helpful. He claimed he only ate the healthy ones, that vegetables were good, but human meat was better, cleaner, softer, and most disturbing of all, he seemed to believe what he was doing was normal. Durangel Vargas was deemed unfit for trial and institutionalized. For years, reports of his whereabouts were murky. Some said he escaped. Others claimed he still roams near the river. No one is sure. What's certain is this: he didn't kill out of rage or ritual. He killed because he was hungry. And for him, people were food. But if Vargas killed out of need, the next man killed out of frenzy. Because Richard Chase didn't plan his meals. He broke into homes, drank blood straight from the body, and left behind scenes that even seasoned detectives couldn't stomach. He was called the Vampire of Sacramento. And what he did next redefined madness. Richard Chase, the Vampire of Sacramento. He wasn't just a killer, he was chaos in human form. Richard Chase didn't stalk or seduce or charm. He didn't play games. He shattered the rules of serial murder and replaced them with something raw, something feral. In the late 1970s, Sacramento was gripped by fear. Someone was breaking into homes in broad daylight, killing entire families, leaving blood-soaked horror behind. The press called him the Vampire of Sacramento, because Chase didn't just kill, he drank. It started small, animal mutilation, injecting rabbit blood, a fear of poisoning. He believed his organs were shrinking, that his heart would stop unless he consumed blood. His paranoia became delusion, and his delusion became a motive. He shot a man in a drive-by just to see what it felt like. Then he entered a woman's home uninvited, shot her, violated her corpse, drank her blood from a yogurt cup. Days later, he struck again, a family this time. He killed them all, mother, baby, dog. He bathed in blood, ate parts of the organs, defiled everything. It wasn't a scene, it was a massacre, but Chase didn't flee. He returned to his apartment, sat surrounded by jars of organs, a fridge full of body parts, a blender caked in gore. When police arrested him, he didn't resist. He wore an orange parka, stained dark from the inside. Inside prison, he explained his reasoning. He believed Nazis were turning his blood to powder, that only by ingesting fresh blood could he survive. He didn't want to kill. He had to. He died by suicide in his cell in 1980. No remorse, no final words. Just the quiet end of a mind that had rotted from the inside out. Chase was pure psychosis, untreated, uncontainable, a storm in the shape of a man. But as deranged as he was, the next killer was methodical, controlled. He was a university student, smart, polite, from a religious family. And he killed tourists in Ecuador, one at a time, because Gilberto Chamba believed God wanted blood. Gilberto Chamba, the preacher of blood. He wasn't loud, he wasn't unhinged. He didn't wear the madness on his sleeve. Gilberto Chamba looked ordinary, educated, quiet, polite. The kind of man you wouldn't think twice about sitting next to on a bus. But inside, a storm of scripture, blood and obsession was brewing. In the late 1990s, Ecuador faced a string of brutal, unexplained murders. The victims were all women, tourists, students, travelers, found strangled, dismembered. Some with flesh missing, some never found at all. Authorities were stumped, until they arrested Gilberto Chamba, a theology student with a haunting past. Years earlier, in his home country of Ecuador, Chamba had murdered a woman, brutally, and claimed it was part of God's plan. He was sentenced to prison, but later released. Instead of reforming, he moved to Spain, and there the cycle began again. He targeted women who were alone, foreign, vulnerable. He lured them in with conversation, with kindness, with the ease of a man who'd done it all before. And once alone, he killed. Chamba later confessed to 9 murders, but investigators suspect the number could be far higher. What made it more chilling was the motive he cited: divine instruction. He believed he was chosen, that each victim was a sacrifice, that he wasn't sinning, he was serving, cleaning, offering. He showed no remorse. He quoted scripture, compared himself to Old Testament prophets, said the blood was cleansing. And most disturbingly, he said he felt peace afterward. Chamba was finally caught and sentenced to life in prison in Spain. But questions still remain. How many victims were never found? How many sacrifices were buried in silence? And how many times did a predator walk free because he knew how to smile? But if Chamba used faith to justify murder, the next killer used motherhood. Because when Klara Mauerova was arrested in the Czech Republic, she wasn't alone. Her children were involved. And what they did together is almost too disturbing to believe. Klara Mauerova, the cannibal cult mother, Brno, Czech Republic, 2007. Police were investigating something simple: malfunctioning baby monitors. A neighbor had complained of interference, but when they checked the signal, what they saw stopped them cold. A boy, naked, bruised, chained to a radiator, crying. The image was real. The house belonged to Klara Mauerova, a 31-year-old devout mother, a teacher, a woman who appeared devoted to her 2 young sons. But what police uncovered was a nightmare stitched together with faith, fanaticism, and flesh. Klara was part of a bizarre cult, the Grail movement. They preached spiritual purification, divine suffering, and submission to higher will. And for Klara, that meant turning her own home into a torture chamber. Her 2 sons were locked away, starved, burned, cut, their flesh eaten, slowly, deliberately. One of the boys later said he watched his own mother spoon pieces of his body into her mouth. She wasn't alone. Her sister, other cult members, Even a woman pretending to be a 13-year-old girl, later revealed to be a sadistic adult, all played roles in the abuse. It was a closed loop of insanity, fed by shared delusion and blind obedience. The children weren't killed, but what they endured left scars deeper than death. When the story broke, it shocked Europe, not just for its brutality, but for who had committed it. A mother, a teacher, someone trusted. Clara was arrested, tried, and sentenced to 9 years in prison. Her sister received a longer term. Other members were scattered, silenced. But even now, people wonder, how many more victims were there? How many more children were used for sacrifice in the name of purification? Because when evil wears the mask of maternal love, there's nowhere safe. But if Clara was driven by cult madness, the final killer on our list was driven by hunger and profit. Fritz Hamann wasn't just a cannibal. He was a butcher, a black market meat dealer, and the product was human. Fritz Hamann, the butcher of Hanover, Germany, post-World War I, a nation broken, hunger everywhere, chaos on every corner, and in the city of Hanover, a merchant rose from the shadows, Fritz Hamann. To the public, he was a tradesman, a meat vendor, a man who helped feed a starving population. But beneath the surface, he was something far darker. Between 1918 and 1924, at least 24 young men, mostly teenage boys, vanished after last being seen with Hamann. Many were homeless, jobless, searching for food or shelter. Hamann offered both. But his generosity came with a price. He would lure them to his apartment with promises of safety, and then kill them quickly with a bite to the throat. Yes, a bite. He was called the Vampire of Hanover for a reason, but he didn't stop there. Hamann would then dismember the bodies with surgical precision, strip the meat, package it, and authorities believe sell it to neighbors, to restaurants, even to schools. He sold human flesh under the guise of pork, sausage, mince. In a city desperate for food, no one asked questions. Police only caught him when bones began washing up in the river. And even then, the truth was almost too grotesque to believe. At trial, Hamann confessed without shame. He described his methods, his motives, his hunger. Some of the meat, he said, tasted better than others. The courtroom erupted. The public reeled. But Fritz Hamann never blinked. He was executed by guillotine in 1925. But the echoes of what he did, of how close his crimes came to every dinner table in Hanover, still linger. Because in the end he wasn't alone. From greasy diners to crumbling cottages, from whispered prayers to cold metal hooks, every killer in this story turned the human body into a meal. Some said it was love, others madness. A few called it art, but all of them took more than life. They devoured memory, turned people into smoke, bone, silence. And maybe that's the real horror. Not that they ate flesh, but that piece by piece they erased someone, as if they were never here at all.